Thank you, and it is good to be home. This will always be my home. I happened to think about 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon that with the weather I was not going to make it today, so I came in last night, and so it gave me the morning to sort of wander around town, visit people, and catch up. It's always going to be my home. It is still my home, so it's good to be here. My family reminded me yesterday they really had no idea why I was doing this. They thought it was, as my son said, "Are you representing the assisted living group?" And I said, "No, not really." But I see now we're one of the sponsors, so between me and the bar that I hope we help pay for, I will try to take just a few minutes and do that. So I now understand why I'm here. I enjoyed immensely my time and my engagement with Leadership Louisville, and I always pled guilty to being a little bit of a history groupie. So I tried when I was here to give some context to what was going on within the city of Louisville and to try to understand where we might be going. And I say we because I still think of it as my city. One of the things that I did when I left 10 years ago this month was I had spoken to the Leadership Louisville class about where we were in the context of what we had been. And that is, in the 20th century, we had had a pretty good model of what we were. And that model was that the politics and the business and the social part was very much intertwined. That wealth, politics, business, philanthropy was all in a very narrow circle of predictable outcomes and for the most part, predictable players. It had produced extraordinary results. But with a lot of changes when organizations sold out locally, when generations passed, the baton was inconsistent. And so we were wrestling a bit for what to do with leadership at that time. And we talked about how we identified leaders, the role Leadership Louisville could play, what other organizations could play in identifying people to pick up that baton and move it forward. And so with that, I left town and began to understand what I didn't have where I now live. And I want to talk about that a little bit. One of the things that you take for granted when you are a Louisvillian, and I only realized that when I left, was in my lifetime, and I'm in my 70th year, we have had unparalleled municipal government that was excellent. Mayors, county judges, city councils, aldermen, fiscal court people, all people of impeccable interest and integrity. There aren't many communities in the country you can say that about. And when you live in a city at times where 4 of the council people have been indicted in the last 6 months, and where you see what goes on in other parts of the country, you understand how unique and how important that was. We got the best and the brightest to serve, and we still do. Very, very important. But there are limitations on what we can do in a city this size. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit tonight, and perhaps how we might address some of those limitations. First of all, let me say that I think the city's doing very well, and I don't say that gratuitously. I watch it. I still take newspapers and business papers, et cetera, and I do read and follow a good bit of what's going on here. It's of an interest to me. And I watch that it's done very well through some difficult years, and it continues to do well. Here are some of the limitations and anxieties that I see. And I can say this as a 7th generation Kentuckian and a 3rd generation Louisvillian. We are in Kentucky. And that has often not been in the best interest of Louisville. The Kentucky governorship and the Kentucky legislative leadership has inconsistently found urban interests to be paramount, has very often not been bestowed with bold leadership, and as such, we're always having to deal with being a very successful urban area in a state where bold leadership is not always present. And we've done very well in spite of having to participate in a lot of arguments and a lot of issues which we shouldn't have to deal with, partially because we're not the state capital. That really, in a Columbus or an Indianapolis or a Nashville, that's a lockstep. That really helps a lot. But what we have learned even though we're still arguing over local sales tax, and we're still arguing over the right to the issues with gambling that Ed's very involved with, we've learned how to navigate through that stream. But what we still don't have is the revenue stream that we deserve. So we're somewhat limited by the amount of what initiatives we can move forward because of our limited revenue stream. And because I watch the population aging a bit here, and I see it really aging in Kentucky, that's an amber flag, if not a red flag, of some of the things we need to make sure we do, like keeping our young people and making sure that this is a vibrant place to work, not just to live. It was always a very easy thing for me to say, what a great place to live. It is a great place to live, but people who live have to make a living, and we need to make sure that we're doing that aggressively and that we're addressing the right things. And here's some of the things that worry me, not only about Louisville, but any city this size. I want to talk about what you all know, but what we're having to live with. We are living in a world of just absolutely unparalleled technological change. You know that. You understand it. It makes the issue of capital and labor, mobile labor, and the movement of capital very easy. It also deals with the fact that most of the technology we've had to deal with since I left in 2004 is not product-based technology. It's process technology. It's technology to make everything more productive. It's technology to take out people. That's the reality of what's happening with technology. And we need to understand what that does to a community. We need to understand what it does to business. So I invite you to do what we're doing with the Federal City Council in Washington, is that we've got a very intensive study going on to say, if these processes speed up, and there's no reason that they will not, what does it mean for our population? Who gets left behind? What level of educational attainment is forever gone, forever out of work? What companies are susceptible to processes and improvement in processes, and what does that do to employment levels? What does that do to the demands of what we're turning out from the Jefferson County Public School System or the University of Louisville or Catherine Spalding or Bellarmine? If, in fact, we cannot create jobs to replace jobs that are being replaced by process, what do? And here's the frightening part. In most of my life, life was evolutionary. That is, in fact, we moved from one stage to another in a business. We got a little bit better each year, and we improved this, improved that. Doesn't happen that way anymore. We're living in a world that is not sequential, where things don't happen sequentially. We're living in a world where they happen consecutively, where the internal processes of the company, where the things that a company or an institution, be it the Louisville Orchestra or Brown-Forman, have to deal with consecutively. And that calls for different kind of leadership, to different kind of threat. And it makes all institutions, not for profit, fragile, subject to being totally replaced. Retail, telecommunication, entertainment, healthcare, banking. I have tried to decide whether you can just live with your iPhone and all of its apps. Much like the movie that almost won an award, the guy lives with his computer. I used to think that was far-fetched, but you can, in fact, substantially reduce processes. And why is that important? It goes directly to the employment levels of the community you live in. So my plea, number one, is that you understand what's at risk. You understand what processes could do to your community, who's susceptible to it, what it could do, what it means for those people who are out of the educational system, and in fact, what we have decided in Washington, that for people who do not hold a high school degree, sadly, they may be forever unemployable. Forever unemployable. That's a difficult reality to deal with, but it's something that every community has to come to grips with as it understands what it's faced. And it has the intellectual honesty to say, you know, if this happens, we're in deep trouble. Or if this doesn't happen, So I think that's characteristic number one. Be intellectually honest, look at the processes that are going on, see what's susceptible of that in your community, and understand the reality of what that demands of your educational system and what it demands of your community to fill in the gaps. Issue number two, leadership. How do you have leadership in a world that is everything happens consecutively? How do you prepare people for that? We've always had the model in leadership programs of bringing people in, telling them what's going on, working with them, trying to explain, here's what's going on in healthcare, here's what's going on in education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Hard to have that model work when everything's happening simultaneously. So how do you prepare leaders, and what kind of leaders do we need? First, leadership today, and I distinguish that from authority. Leadership is different than authority. It's easy to have authority, but leadership is probably more finite today than ever before. Whether you're the mayor, whether you're Greg, whether you're the governor, whether you're running a company, you'd be amazed when you really stop and think how little you can control. You can't control your competitive environment. You very often can't control your regulatory environment. You may not be able to control in this new vocal world of employees, your employee environment. It's a different world, and leadership has got to be more nimble and less authoritarian than ever before, because you cannot control what you could have controlled even 10 to 15 years ago. How do you pick someone who has to work with moral suasion, with communication skills, with the gravitas of understanding all that's going on in the world and bringing the troops along in a world where you can no longer be directive? They don't like what you're doing, they'll leave. Very different leadership. In addition, one of the things that I think we're going to have to do is, in leaders, we're going to have to do, returning to what I said a moment ago, is we're going to have to decide what is a priority. We do this in business every day. We shed businesses, we defund them, we move around, we go out of business, etc. How do you do that in a community? How do you decide what's important in a community? It's very difficult to do. If you have all of the things occurring concurrently, and if you're trying to decide what to do with your organization, how do you lead it, and how do you decide what's important? Let me give you a perfect example. Education. I've spent my life, and once again, I'm involved in the K through 12 activity in the District of Columbia, which is a broken system. Online education is on its way. I've been in a myriad number of conversations with higher ed, with Georgetown and Maryland and other places, where people kind of don't want to hear that, it's a passing fad, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is not a passing fad. It is relentless, and it's on its way. So the question is, do we have the university and the college system locally and the public school system locally that says, you're right. We're not going to play defensive ball. We're going to start trying to make sure we understand where we fit in and how we do this. And it is coming. It is coming. And in fact, it's here. And part of the reason it's here is that, particularly in higher education, it takes too long and it's too expensive. And $1.3 trillion in debt. Second only to home mortgages in this country. That's a public policy issue that is not going to sustain itself. That has sustained the growth of higher ed and has given it the license in some ways to be not as good very often as measuring their efficiency as they need to be. That's over. And as budgets shrink in states, and as now most states are reducing their contribution to higher ed, it's going to have to be much more efficient, and it's going to change. And having been on 32 years of university boards, you're going to need to support the universities. You're going to have to be their partners. You're going to have to be the partner of the Jefferson County Public School System to help them, because believe me when I say this, in education, every inefficiency has a constituency. So you're going to have to be there to help them move through this. And you need to start holding your hand up now and say, what are we doing about this? Stanford has opened an office in Washington solely for online education. I told the story that my son was with me, my high schooler was with me in China 2 weeks ago. He took his high school physics and trig test online with Skype from a hotel in Chengdu, China, with his high school, watching one another. The teacher was proctoring and he was in the midst of a class. Now, you're talking to a guy who worries about how to get Netflix to work. It's here. It's here. And it holds the opportunity to make you a center to attract young people. Because the millennials don't have the money or the time or the inclination to do what all of us did in the process of higher ed. I would hold up the hand of Leadership Louisville and others and say, what are we doing and what are we doing now? Because what you do not want to do is you do not want your educational institutions to become anachronisms. And table stakes in this country is a good education system within the community. It's a total non-starter if you can't deliver that. The last item I think is really important, has nothing to do with technology, has nothing to do with the process and the pressures of business and the changes we have to deal with every day. And that is, who's the cultural carrier in the community? Who's in charge of the culture? Forget the educational system, forget the processes, forget unemployment, forget workforce, forget budgets. This is a town with a great cultural history. Orchestras, zoos, parks, river. Government has become increasingly in the business of entertainment, whether it's a Yum Center or 4th Street Live or whatever. It's a growing thing. Who's deciding? Who's in the dialogue? Who's leading the dialogue about the cultural carrier? It is the one thing that we live with today that lends itself to contemplation and reflection, which are almost becoming passé in our culture. Stop and think what we want to do and be about culture. I just returned from 10 days in China. It's a stunning story. It was a business trip, so I was stunned. But the one thing I did learn was it is acultural. They're not interested in culture. They're interested in economics. They're interested in earnings per share. They're interested in getting ahead. They're interested in being like us. But they're acultural. In town after town I was in, where's your cultural center? Tell me about, they look at you like their eyes glaze over. I don't want this country to become that. I don't want this city to become that. While we have to deal with earnings per share and processes and who wins in this and who loses in that, who is deciding what's culturally important? Who's the convener of that? Is it Leadership Louisville? Perhaps it could be. Who's looking and saying, how much support does Jim Welch need in helping restart the orchestra? How important is the orchestra? Tough questions. A lot of cultural institutions, no one wants to be the skunk at the picnic and ask the tough question about what should survive and what should be fed and what is okay. But beneath all of it, that which makes this community unique, that which makes this community historically great, has a lot to do with the culture. So I think the last thing for you to worry about is who is carrying the cultural baton? Who's having the dialogue? Who are you listening to? It is very often difficult to know how to fit history into that, because when we take history into culture, we either demonize it for what it used to be or what we don't want it to be, or we hold it up in some sort of halo effect of which it doesn't need to be anymore and perhaps never was. It's the most difficult conversations in a community is what should the culture be and what's important to maintain. So in the midst of stunning success in a community, and I really mean that, and in the midst of a community which is still an extraordinarily attractive place, understand the risks of what could happen with this ongoing Alvin Toffler-like future shock technology. It's just almost too much to understand for everyone. But it could decimate a community if they don't understand it. Number two, make sure you have the people that are in charge of institutions and government that have the intellectual nimbleness to deal with something that is more complex than ever before. And they don't think sequentially, they think concurrently. And number three, if you get all that right, what do you want to be? That's the culture. And that is the thing that everybody in the community needs to be involved in, because that's what makes you unique. And that's what has historically made you attractive. I hope this helps. I wish you the very best of luck in doing this. I hope I can come back and help before I make Cave Hill. And thank you very much.